Welcome, everyone. My guest today is Courtenay Dunn, Senior Director of Government Affairs at ICE, to talk about GSE reform, deregulation, housing affordability, and more. I want to thank our sponsor, Optimal Blue, for making this episode possible. Courtenay, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome to ICE Experience. Thank you for coming out and supporting us this year.
It's been amazing. Lots of great sessions, but also lots of great time to talk with people. And the vendors that we've gotten to meet in the expo hall, just everything has been really great. So, and lots of fun parties too, of course, Las Vegas. So thanks for sitting down with us, especially at this time. I think a lot of people, I know you are a hot commodity. People are wanting to ask you things, and I want to ask you some of the same things. So let's start at the top and talk about GSE reform is something that I think a lot of lenders are like, where are we in that? What do we expect in that? So how do you answer when people ask you about GSE reform?
Sure. So you're right. This is a topic of conversation that's been around Washington, D.C. really since the beginning of the conservatorships. And I think what we've seen from the Trump administration at this point is that it's obviously been acknowledged, I think, that the Trump administration takes the position that the conservatorships were never intended to last forever. However, we've heard from Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, Senate Banking Chairman Tim Scott, other leaders in the Trump administration that right now there are other very important and timely issues they want to take care of before they'll enter into a deeper discussion about what some type of exit may look like. So, for example, this week, we were just discussing that there's a continuing resolution. The House has just passed. So the Senate's laser focused on that. Then we'll have a little bit of a break. And remember, we still don't even have all of the agency heads in place. So while the FHFA director nominee, Bill Pulte, is ahead of hearing, his vote has not been scheduled, although I believe they did file for that vote, and we might see that maybe sometime in April. But until all of those pieces fall into place, I think the administration is ready to focus on the other top of the day items that they're addressing right now.
That's helpful to think about, even just a timeline, like you said. Like if you don't have those things at least in place or on paper, then there's probably not anything that's going to happen before that. And I think I think one of the things that is so hard for industry is just uncertainty, right?
Right.
So what question do you get asked the most when people are like, what's happening in Washington? Like, what are they most concerned about?
I think certainly from an ICE experience perspective, one of the questions I've had a lot this week is about the regulatory process. Where do regulations stand? I've received a lot of questions about many of the executive orders that have been issued. So I think it's helpful to sort of take a quick look at where we stand. So as we just discussed, there's several agency heads that are not in place yet. So we don't have an idea, maybe just yet, of where their policies will be headed. But we do know that Trump has issued several executive orders related to just the regulatory review process. So there's a couple that I find notable that I think our colleagues in the mortgage and banking industry will find relevant. First, there was an order that directed all of the banking regulators to issue, when they issue a notice of proposed rulemaking, to accompany that notice for a new regulation with a list of 10 that can be walked back. There was a subsequent executive order that also directed all the agency heads to review by April 20th and report back to all the agencies, report back their agency heads to the administration, the DOJ team, of the regulations they have. There was a list of 7 criterion that related to the cost of the regulation, any barriers to modernization and technology, different topics like that have been priorities, some on issues Trump has campaigned on, and to report back on those regulations. I suspect that that information will be taken in and then reviewed. And then the third one that I also found interesting was about just the regulatory process for all of these agencies. The order indicates that the new regulations that will be proposed will not only go through OIRA, but will also be reviewed in conjunction with the OMB. So that's a little bit different step than we've seen in the past. Again, this was one of the executive orders that was just issued in February. And I think, again, until we get heads in at CFPB, FHFA, we don't know how all of that will play out, but I think those are some distinctions that are a little bit different from what we've seen in regulation in the past, and we'll see how those play out as to certain policy proposals. But I can tell you one focus that Trump had during his campaign and just last week, the Treasury Secretary was at the Economic Club in New York and spoke to this, is a real focus of this administration on deregulation.
Right.
The responsible regulation by what they've indicated is maybe a reprivatization, certainly on the domestic economic policy front. I do think that's a focus of this administration, is to really look at costs versus public benefit of regulation, to not impede modernization, to really look to technology to aid markets. So that's good news, I think, for a lot of us, certainly here at ICE Experience, and a lot of our clients and partners who are very interested in how we can help try to reduce the costs of getting a mortgage, to think of creative ways to make our processes more efficient and transparent, and really, in effect, to bring more life to the American dream of homeownership.
I think that is, I think everyone in our industry sort of cheered when just the deregulation orders came through, and not knowing exactly what that looks like for us. But if you're thinking that you have to, take out 10, or if that's the focus, that's something that people are very excited about. At the same time, we know that the state regulation is in some ways ramping up. What do you see the states doing in reaction to what's happening at the federal level?
It's a great point, Sarah. I'm glad you brought this up. And we've seen the states become much more active, I would say, over the past 5+ years. I think one of the most evident examples would be the privacy regimes. So, of course, we saw California stand up and enact their own privacy regime. I think there has been a theme throughout a variety of states across the country of picking up issues that are important to their constituents, to people who live in their states, as a perceived reaction to maybe a paralysis in Congress to act on certain issues that are very important, but have been a little bit more difficult to get a kind of 50-state consensus on at the federal level. So we've seen a lot of activity in consumer finance. I mentioned privacy. We have seen some states go ahead and tackle the issue of AI and AI regulation at the state level. And then I would also note that we've seen the attorneys general become more active. So again, my reminder for everyone has been that these laws are all very relevant. Certainly in the mortgage industry, we're all very well aware that there's a federal, state, and local regime for those of us that we do business with. And this is more important than ever to be aware of those changes and to understand how they impact all of our businesses.
So I remember in the first Trump administration, you had NYDFS, for instance, right? New York Department of Financial Services, I think.
Yes.
That they really stepped up, and they're like, sort of felt like, okay, we're going to fill the void. Whether there was a void to fill or not is another question. So when you talk about state attorneys general, is that separate from those, separate departments that might pop up for financial services?
Sure, yes. Thank you for highlighting that. So yes, it is different. And the New York DFS has been very on the cutting edge. They're very interested in technology. And again, I think their base of constituents in New York are technology, their businesses. So these states also want to enable companies to do business in their states. We've certainly seen a lot of movement on that front of companies moving to different states that they may feel may be more business friendly, that enable them to do the work that they want to do, maybe be a little bit more innovative. So yes, those departments are popping up, and they're certainly work in tandem sometimes with the attorneys general, but they are separate and have separate functions.
Gotcha. I mean, I think one of the things people would say about the CFPB is just that whole kind of like enforcement, regulation by enforcement, right? Whereas they would rather have tell us clearly what we can and cannot do, and don't make us try to figure out from, a paragraph put out on social media, or something that they did with a company. What do you see states doing? Do they tend to be like, we're going to pass these laws, we're going to do that, or is it regulation by enforcement when at the state level?
The states operate differently, as you know, than the federal level, and each state legislature is unique, which is what makes tracking the stateside issues somewhat more complex in a way, because every state has a different process. They have a different legislative session. Some of them meet every year, some of them don't.
Texas, for instance.
Exactly.
Right?
And then, of course, they can always call back special sessions. So they tend to, in my experience, the states are very interested in engagement. They want to meet and hear from people who do business in their states. Again, all the states want to be a place to open business, and they may have different viewpoints on how regulation should operate, but there is a very real engagement with all types of different stakeholders who want to come and participate in their processes. And I think the communication about issues that are important to us in mortgage and housing is really essential as policies are developed to understand how we do business and really the operations of obtaining a mortgage, going through the mortgage finance process, owning a home. Those are really important, and I think it's great. Publications like yours, Sarah, at HousingWire, really engaging its readers, making everyone aware of what's going on, and coalescing to discuss what we think will be best, again, to really help people get into homes in a time where the market's been pretty tough.
So, on that, the very first day that Trump was elected, on Inauguration Day, he sat down and did a bunch of executive orders, and one of the first ones had to do with housing, which was an emergency relief act, right, to make housing more affordable. What is it like being in Washington right now, where housing is one of the topics that comes up day one, and he's also talked a lot about interest rates, right, mortgage rates.
Right.
So when there have been times, for us covering it, where it's like, housing never gets mentioned, or it doesn't feel like it's a priority. What does that look like now?
Yeah, it is a great question, and I think it's been really interesting to a lot of us who've been around in this industry for a long time to have seen it really come up even in the campaigns as much as it did. So I think we're going to see, obviously, as we discussed, more specific policy matters coming forth as the people take their seats at the agencies. They do this sort of like regulatory review. But I would note that we are, today, in fact, there was a Senate banking hearing on housing affordability through Senate Banking Chairman Tim Scott. So they had a variety of different witnesses come in and talk about the different issues. He's been very dedicated to community banks, opportunity zones. That is something also you've seen President Trump talk about, certainly HUD Secretary Scott Turner, even Secretary Bessent, talking about the importance of community and regional banks. How can we use opportunity zones? As we know, Secretary Turner was in the prior administration where that was a big focus, and that's something that Senator Scott has always been laser focused on. So I think we'll see more interest in how can we enable these banks to serve our local communities? How can we really dig in at these local levels to address these acute affordability issues? Because while different regions of the country have different types of issues, really this is an issue that is affected all Americans.
Well, it's also housing affordability is part of the mission of Fannie and Freddie. It's part of, it's central to the goals that different government agencies have. So no matter who's in the White House, right, those things stay constant.
Agreed.
Housing affordability would be one of them. Some of those things, though, they flex a little bit. So when I think about the PAVE task force, right, which is on appraisal bias, where are we with that? Is that dead in the water? Is that still something that people are talking about and doing?
Sure. So the PAVE task force itself has ended, and that ended during the Biden administration, and they had promulgated in connection with the other banking agencies rules related to property valuations. And some of those rules were set to go into effect in October of this year, October 2025. And I suspect there will be a review of those. There's different types of procedural tools that can be used for certain types of laws that were passed or regulations. But I think what's also important, from the folks that I talk to in our industry and clients and the people I work with in DC, is that a lot of us want to, like you said, be able to understand the rules, but there's a lot of good that's being done now to identify how can we more accurately, for example, value properties.
Right.
How can we use technology? How can we use data to make these processes better? And we don't need to wait for regulation to do that. We can innovate on that now, and a lot of people here, this has been an issue we've talked about here at ICE Experience. A lot of our clients are talking about this. So we don't need to wait for the government to set regulations to go ahead and make these processes better, because really everybody wants to compete. They want their consumers, their clients to come to them who want to make mortgages with them and do business. And that kind of competition begets better prices for consumers and better products. And the more accurate and the better they are, that doesn't matter what's happening in Washington, D.C. or any of the stateside regulations. Our clients want to do that. We want to help people, certainly enable them to comply with the laws, but to also just do their business better regardless of what the law is.
So if you're a lender out there and you're in the situation where those PAVE rules are supposed to go into effect in the fall, but probably going to be pulled back, have people already started that process? Do you feel like people are kind of on hold with that? Those specific things?
I think there are people who already had been looking at their processes now. There also had been some lawsuits and a variety of other issues around some of these practices, and I think again in the industry recognize this is a place that's probably ripe for some modernization. So there will always be. Everyone has a different tolerance for their adoption and how they do it, but really largely I think it's a conversation that continues to be had. In fact, 2 weeks ago, FHFA had held its annual appraisal workshop, and they have representatives from all across the appraisal and valuation industry to talk about modernization that's going on at Fannie and Freddie, importantly also. So a lot of these, fair lending laws are still on the books. Everyone's aware of that, and the modernization is still taking place as well it should.
So tell us a little bit about Scott Turner. He's a person that, worked with Ben Carson before, right? So do you feel like this, we're going to see a HUD that is very similar to what we saw in Trump 1?
I think he is laser focused on ensuring a few things, addressing the cost of homeownership. He's hit the ground running. He is out talking to people on the ground. He's been to a few of the disaster zones, and again is really focused on the opportunity zones. So I think he's going to take his time to take in everything that's going on, what he has. Look at the teams at HUD, how to best effectuate, again, maybe some of this deregulation and hope to address some of the costs of homeownership, certainly. And they have a lot on their plate at HUD to address across the various markets, not just obviously residential. So I think they'll be doing that. And as they get people into seats, again, I think we'll be able to see more specific issues arise out of those. And I fully expect that we're going to hear a lot more from him soon, and we're all looking forward to it.
So, I remember back to last spring and a series of conferences from the stage of like an MBA, for instance, they were talking about a housing czar. And I think part of this is because there was just frustration that it's like housing is an issue that needs to be solved, housing affordability, just some of these things. And it was like, we need a housing czar. And at that time, I interviewed a few people from HUD and be like, is that you? Do you think in your own mind, do we still need a housing czar? Do you feel like, is there any talk of that in Washington at this point? Or is it more like we're tackling housing, it's just not going to be through one person?
Sure. We had all heard some of what I call the cocktail chit chat about the housing czar, and that had been floated by some in our industry, and there was some palace intrigue about who that might be. I think the reality is, though, there are a lot of people who do address that issue throughout the White House. Obviously, we have people that will sit on the National Economic Council who are also involved in that. We have the HUD secretary. They're all very involved and dedicated to that. So I'm not sure if we per se need one specific person, but I do think that the administration has articulated an effort to maybe have more conversation between regulators, because on my end, I think the concern I hear from those in the industry is if we have some type of rules or initiatives or proposals that seemingly conflict when they come from different agencies. So I think the more collaboration and conversation there are across any administration, but across all the agencies to sort of understand how those pieces work together will give our industry a little bit more security to say, okay, I'm not going to have 3 different regimes that I have to comply with, and maybe I don't really understand how that works.
That is such a great point. I attended the FHFA's tech sprint last summer, and as different groups would come up and present like, hey, this is our idea, there was a panel of judges, and in more than one case, in several cases, they were like, that's a great idea. How are you going to how are you going to rectify the fact that that's fine with this agency, but this agency says you can't do that? And just the bottleneck that is present within the interagency, right, for somebody who's really trying to innovate, for instance, it really was brought home to me through that exercise. And I was just like, man, there's just so much. I think that's part of what is trying to be solved right now.
Right, and I think there is some interest in engaging as these new agencies are getting their legs under them. In fact, I saw a notice today from the OCC about its office hours for technology. So they've been, we have acting director Rodney Hood over at the OCC right now, and is very dedicated to financial inclusion and modernization and ensuring that there's the proper risk management controls in place and how technology will play a role in those issues. So I think they're all gathering information from everyone who's willing to share with them, and that will probably and hopefully color some policies going forward.
Maybe Mark Calabria is our housing czar. So he's over at OMB, and unusually, Trump has said, he really wants to pull a lot of what were formerly independent agencies sort of under OMB, or at least there's a process where like whatever they decide has to be run through OMB, which is different. I think that will be interesting to look at, to see what happens there.
Sure, and we have that. I believe you're referring to one of the executive orders. So we'll see how that plays out going forward as the agencies start to interact with each other, and if there's an opportunity to look at some of the regulatory processes and make them more efficient across a variety of agencies, then I think most people would welcome that.
So let's take a step back and go, if you're out there running a business, I think one of the things that's been so different about the first couple months of this administration is just how, or not even a couple months yet, right? Say 6 weeks, is just how fast things are moving. It's the velocity of change. It's the uncertainty. What do you tell people who are like, I don't know what's happening, or it feels like I have to, I can't keep up, or, how do I run my business this way? Or what advice would you give to them as someone who's like right in the thick of it?
It's hard to believe, but as you've alluded to, we're not even past our first 100 days yet. So we're only about halfway through that process. The administration came in very prepared. They had a lot of issues that they'd campaigned on. They're executing on them, and they came in very prepared to move forward on a lot of those issues. So again, I think we're steady as she goes. A lot of us are the same from a regulatory point of view. The same fair lending laws and other statutes are on the books, and people can will want to continue to do business and abide by those processes that they have. And it's always hard to tell. I'm not going to guess certainly what may happen in the market, but people want to be prepared to do business and serve their customers whenever they're ready to. And I think in the meantime, maybe keep an eye out for what are the top issues that should be communicated to these agencies. So in DC, of course, we have all of our trade associations and others who are sort of gathering their lists of, okay, for example, a lot of the industry was engaged on the Reg X revision proposal at CFPB, and a lot of the feedback I had received was that there were some modernizations, particularly following COVID, and what we learned during the COVID years that could help in modernization of some of the processes, and that there were lenders and servicers who would like to have that conversation. So I think it's important to think about, we will have some fresh eyes on some of these issues, but there may be opportunities to engage, to talk about what has worked, what has not worked, what would be helpful to the industry. As you alluded to earlier, it's always more helpful when there's a process where you can have some engagement as opposed to maybe receiving regulations or some types of notices that are maybe unclear. People want to understand the rules and they want to follow the law. And I think when there's collaboration across the industry, it works well for all of us to understand how our different pieces fit together. So I do think there's an opportunity for that our industry can look forward to. And again, I know our leaders in Washington that work at our trade associations and others are preparing for that, and that will be good engagement when that comes time.
So everyone needs to stay engaged with the advocacy groups and let things be known that they're thinking about the challenges they have, what they hope to see out of Washington. I know there's some very specific things happening, so it's always good to make your voice heard. And I'll put in a little plug in here for HousingWire. Of course, this is what we do day in and day out. We are dedicated to trying to get that information that's ever changing, that changes so fast, out to the audience. But so glad to have you on, Courtenay. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Sarah. You are all doing a great job. Again, we appreciate you being here at Experience and look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.
Absolutely.